I traveled all over Africa. I was there researching the methods used by the independence movements in different parts of Africa to take back to Chicago to implement within the civil rights movement. That was a wonderful experience in which I fell in love with Africa. About a little over a decade later, it was close to noon, with the temperature approaching 110 degrees, when Don Johansen, trusting a lucky feeling that had been with him since daybreak, detoured into a gully at Hadar in Ethiopia. He spotted a bit of a hominid arm, then the back of a hominid skull, a thigh bone, a couple of vertebrae, part of a pelvis, and ribs. Don wondered aloud, a single individual? 3 weeks of subsequent digging produced 40% of a 3.5 million year old hominid skeleton, brought to the surface after millennia by rains at Hadar. Discovering Lucy on November 30, 1974, accelerated knowledge of human evolution. It upped the ante on Africa as the evolutionary site for Homo sapiens and set off a blizzard of genetic research. It was about 15 years later, 1988, when Newsweek produced the article on Rebecca Kahn's and her research team's genetic discovery of an ancient East African mother of all living humans, the mitochondrial Eve. And when I read that article, I said, I want to tell Eve's story. I had no clue how I was going to do it. And I became an artist. I took time to get a master's degree in literary nonfiction, all with this idea of telling Eve's story. And then in 2010, I took my first DNA test with the Genographic Project of National Geographic. And then I opened this sketchbook and using information from their website, I began to work on Eve's story, which obviously begins in Africa. So the very first piece I did was this piece, We All Come from Eve. But even before Homo sapiens, hominids had discovered fire and were already using stone tools. Now, the place where our evolution took place was here in the Rift Valley, which is the womb of human evolution. So every child that's born anywhere in the world carries this entire heritage of evolution right down through Lucy, through Homo sapiens to now. As we, Homo sapiens, have moved around the world, a continuous process of mutation has been going on. And that's why some of us have lighter skin, some people have darker skin, some people are taller, some people are stockier, depending on the various conditions that they that they met with. Within Africa, there grew up two cultures, an inland culture and a coastal culture. The inland culture followed the animals and hunted them. The coastal culture lived on the fruits of the sea. And there are some scientists, including Stephen Oppenheimer, who's a British scientist, who opine that it was the eating of the meat and the fish that allowed our human brains to expand and differentiate. Now, everywhere within Africa, people, Homo sapiens, walked. And they walked within grasslands, and they walked amongst animals such as the Somali giraffe. They were able to observe and enjoy the East African crested crane, the red and yellow babette, and the lilac-breasted puller, all birds that often sat on the backs of the animals that they hunted. They were able to walk south, west, northwest, east. They could not walk north because they were blocked by the Saharan desert. Now, in earlier times, the Sahara had not been a desert. And during those periods of time, the earlier hominids, two-leggeds, had made it up into Eurasia. But Homo sapiens, by the time they had evolved, faced a vast desert. But about 75,000 years ago, an event occurred here at the tip of the Red Sea, at a passing that is called the Gate of Tears. And one can only imagine why it has that name. It's a very difficult passage to cross. However, Oppenheimer opines that these people living along the coast their population had multiplied to such an extent that they were outstripping their food source. And they stood here at the Gate of Tears and gazed across and yearned for the green hills of Yemen, because Arabia, 75,000 years ago, was green. And he says, they could see it across that very narrow passage. And so some group, some clan, some individuals decided to make a go for it. And we assume that they must have made some rafts that they put their supplies on, and that they probably put the women and the children on. But then mostly we can surmise that it was the men who guided the rafts and swam across. We have no idea how many there were, how many made it, how many didn't make it, but obviously some of them did. And that is known as the first coastal migration, the first water migration. Now, when they got there, what they encountered were animals. Camels, horses, elephants, some form of oxen, cattle, and the ferocious Bengal tiger. But they also confronted some of those earlier hominids that had gotten there, who were not at all happy to see them and were rather ferocious in holding them off. It was about 65,000 years ago that they reached the western coastal shores of India, and they mainly had to stay there for quite a while as they figured out how to deal with these ferocious predecessors. But over time, they began to get into the south, central, and northern India. Some of them had reached central India, and they found the Bhimbetka cave. And they inscribed on the walls of that cave some of the most beautiful cave art you can imagine. And many of these images are from Bhimbetka cave. It's the cave art that's been found there. I put in a couple of more contemporary pieces just for the practice, so you could identify this region of the world. I included the islands because I wanted to emphasize that we were still doing this coastal migration. Now, we can ask the question, well, how did they know how to get wherever they were going, although they probably didn't know where they were going. But we assume, and most likely they were following the sun, the moon, and the stars. And they had, through oral culture and memorization, they passed that on because they have found when it came to the Bronze Age, there were elaborate star charts made that obviously they had to have had that knowledge previously in order to do that. I was most fascinated by, when I was working on this navigation instrument called the astrolabe, which was invented by the Greeks, but perfected by the Arabs. And Arabs created some of the most beautiful astrolabes you will ever see. I mean, real works of art. I mean, they were a navigation tool, but they were works of art as well. After those people crossed the southern tip of the Red Sea for the first migration, sometime in there was a seismic eruption 72,000 years ago on the island of Sumatra, from which the hominids, the Homo sapiens, any that had reached there, and all the animals fled. So this was in Indonesia. So when I was working on this area, I became very aware of how each region of the world is determined by its geography. Here in Southeast Asia, you have the Himalayan mountains, and the snow melt from those mountains creates this vast system of rivers that flows all the way down. And that system of rivers creates a very humid atmosphere in which jungle is everywhere. This area, the Mekong Delta, is one of the most fertile areas of the world. It's probably this place where rice was first cultivated. And here in this region where Cambodia is, there was Homo sapiens occupied that region since 3,000 years before the current era. And then from the 6th century to the 15th century, there was a civilization here called the Khmer Empire. And it was a major power throughout this whole area. And from the 12th century on, they had developed an extensive canal system to manage all this water that came from the Himalayas. But, and that was built through collective labor, managed by the Hindu aristocracy and priesthood. And then about 1308, one of the rulers of the Khmer Empire converted from Hinduism to Buddhism, which is a more individually based religion. And all that commitment to collective labor and things began to disintegrate. So that in 1330, when there was climate change, there were 7 years of extensive drought at the same, interspersed with these monstrous monsoons. And when the monsoons came after the droughts, they would just wash through and wash away some of those canals. They overran the system. But by this time, there was no longer any collective will to rebuild them. And so by about 1340, migration out of that region had taken place. And so if you've ever had the opportunity to go to Angkor Wat, you will see how trees have grown down over all of the temple complexes. And from the top of the temple all the way down the sides until the roots find water in the ground. And covered, by I don't know how many years it took after Homo sapiens left, but the jungle just took over. And it was many, many centuries before we had rediscovered this area? Well, it was a region, the Khmer Empire and Angkor Wat covered a geographic region as large as New York City. I mean, it was that huge. And temples were everywhere and canals were everywhere. Now, when Angkor Wat was rediscovered, they found all the temples covered with the jungle. But it wasn't until this various scientists began to collaborate, the environmentalists, the archaeologists, the anthropologists, all these different sciences began to collaborate. They discovered that the water system, the canal system, that was also covered over. But I wanted, especially when I did this area, to kind of have roots, the tree roots coming down, following the rivers. And of course, Homo sapiens were migrating up and down the rivers as well as along the coastline. Now, within all of our journey as Homo sapiens, there has been a religious impulse. So in Africa, it was animism. And Homo sapiens came to understand that there was spirit in everything. The tree has spirit. The rabbit has spirit. The animals, each of the animals we're hunting have spirit. The fish have spirit. Everything has spirit. And you just better be careful how you handle that. Now, by the time they had reached Southeast Asia, they were making a transition from animism into something called shamanism, where they would wear the skins of animals. They would make masks of various animals. They would perform dances and rituals and dramas, and they might be led by a shaman who knew how, through all these different means, to enter a hypnotic trance aided by hallucinogenic plants and interpret for his or her people what was going on in the animal and the vegetable world and how they needed to proceed. Now, that was the first coastal migration from Africa. We're going to transition to the first land migration. Let me just introduce you to the ancient Near East. So this is the area known as the land of the rising sun, the Fertile Crescent, the area in which the wheel was first invented and used, and one of the regions that first cultivated grains. 50,000 years ago, the ice sheets in Eurasia began to melt. And so the Sahara became a vast grassland into which the animals began to move. So Homo sapiens began following those animals, and they followed them up the Nile River into northern, would be today northern Egypt. And by this time, the veneration of the feminine fertility principle had begun to take place. And so I've put a statuette of the famous Egyptian goddess Isis. And from the northern part of Egypt, what is now Egypt, they make their way into Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. Now, Arabia was also green, like the Sahara Desert. And so there were many migrations, and you can trace them here on this map. There were many migrations into northern part of Arabia, into southern part of Arabia, and then within and across Arabia. But anyway, it's only come in the last decade that through satellite imaging, they've been able to discover these underground constructions. And we don't know exactly what these constructions are. They would appear to be something like seasonal residences where they dug into the ground and put stones around to build a base, and then up above they used less permanent materials, and then when they left, they covered it all over so that with some kind of signage so they could find it again, but they went on from there. What fascinated me the most was an image of this trap, this animal trap. So by the time they got to Arabia, these hunters had discovered that they could create an area into which they could drive a whole herd of animals. And then they would slaughter the entire herd, which made for some very nice feasting for a period of time. But later, Homo sapiens would discover that there weren't sufficient animals to hunt, and which led to some other innovations later on. But this is here in the center. This is again stone art, cave art that has been found painted on various walls on stones. They made it from there. Some of the people went to the east. Some people went north. North, they came into the Levant. So there's a stone sickle up there because by this time they were not moving as much. They were staying in locations for longer periods of time. And they developed these stone sickles to cut down the naturally growing grain. They weren't yet cultivating it, but they were capturing it, harvesting it. Again, the fertility symbol was very real for them. And then moving on into, this really is all one area, but this would be Iraq. In this case, I've given contemporary countries their own board as distinct from those others. So you have Egypt, Arabia, which has a lot of countries in it, the Levant, Iraq, Iran, Turkey. Here in Iraq, people settled for longer periods of time. The population kept expanding, and they, of course, developed the Mesopotamian culture. And these people in Mesopotamia discovered that they could take the clay from the bottom of the river and make it into pots. Instead of having to weave baskets to carry things, they could make these pots where they could store the grain. And they began making these tiles upon which they became traders. And as traders, they needed to record who was exchanging what. And so the very first writing that was ever done that we know of was done on these tiles to record these trade agreements. And one of the earliest maps ever found is on a tile and it's a map of the village of Nippur in Mesopotamia. Not the oldest map, but one of the oldest. Moving on further east into Iran, the area known today as Iran. By the time they got there, the hunters had discovered that it was a smarter thing to domesticate the animals than it was to kill them all off. And so the very first domestication of sheep and goats was in Iran, and it was they made it across the Zagros Mountains, and then there were various valleys in there where they did these herds of sheep and goats. And of course, once they had wool, they discovered that they could make clothing out of it and began to give up the reed skirts and things they'd used in the past. The pastoralists from the Zagros Mountains are actually the ones who went over to the Indus Valley in contemporary Afghanistan, Afghanistan, and brought with them the ideas, the tools, etc., to develop an agricultural revolution in the Indus Valley, another great civilization that was contemporaneous with Mesopotamia. They had minerals from the mountains, and so they were very instrumental once we moved into the Bronze Age and the Metal Age. Now, if you go further north into Turkey, the region of Turkey, archaeologists have found in southern Turkey something they call Göbekli Tepe. And this is a hill that the archaeologists have now been digging for over a decade, and they have discovered this construction called, that is circular. It's concentric circles built in stone, and it is now identified as the oldest known stone ceremonial site. It predates Stonehenge, and apparently it was a kind of the university of the era, because it would seem that various clans would send their young people and their wise elders to this place and gather there on some kind of a rotational basis. But when they first arrived, the first thing they did was to construct the site where they were to have their training. And so these concentric circles are seating arrangements. And so the skinners would be in one area, the leather makers in another area, the storytellers in another area. Each one would have their own different area in which to teach what they wanted the next generation to learn. And then when they were finished, they covered it over. They probably, again, left some kind of signage so they could find the area again, because they have discovered 12 different layers. And all built in the same way. But the interesting thing is that the most artistic and the finest craftsmanship is in the base layer. And each time you get to a new layer, it is less sophisticated, less well done, until you get to the top. Why do you think that was?
Sucks.
Sorry? Well, maybe there was a disease that depopulated the area, so there were not as many people to send. Maybe they were driven out. All kinds of things could have happened. Maybe it reached the point where the younger generation didn't care. Not too far from where Göbekli Tepe is, they have discovered what is the oldest known map found. And that is painted on the wall of a residence. We don't know what that map represents, but obviously there were kind of streets or lanes or something. Maybe there were pins, maybe there were houses, we don't know. But behind it is painted these two mountains. And one of them is erupting. And there is evidence that at the same time that this map was painted, there was an eruption of those mountains behind there. So why they painted it on the wall, we don't know. But it is thought to be the oldest map ever discovered. This is, and you can see from the stone art that they were dancing and using musical instruments and wearing masks and wearing animal skins, etc. And that by the time they reached Turkey, they were no longer venerating the goddess. and you'll see up there is the bull. And that was the beginning of the transfer. This is probably about 8,000 years before the current era, maybe 10. It seems as if once they had control over cultivation and over the animals, they no longer related in the same way to Mother Earth, which was a mistake. Migrations are often caused by climatic crises. So most of the time, we look at a mountain, and what we see is something sublime and ethereal. But if Mother Nature, Gaia, decides to let loose and erupt, then she spews forth all kinds of rock and lava and fire and destroys everything in her path. And that is certainly what happened 79 years before, right into the current era, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii and its arena. And we Homo sapiens began to discover once again that we are part of nature. Now, Oceania is a region that was very difficult for me to do because I kept getting confused. From the very first migration, that began 75,000 years ago, Homo sapiens reached Australia. But after they had reached Australia, there was some kind of a geologic event that separated that into a semi-continent broken away from nearby, from New Guinea and other nearby areas. And then the Aboriginal Australians were isolated. And they were, however, they were ingenious in their ability to survive on what is probably one of the most inhospitable climates in the world. Once they had eradicated all the marsupials, big mistake, but once they had done that, then they had to learn how to live off of grubs. They learned how to create a system for farming eels along in the southeastern part where there were rivers like the McMurray River. But they were pretty much separated from anything else that was going on. Because of their long isolation, they created their own system of their own understanding of how they got there. And there is in this book, The Memory Code, Lynn Kelly talks about how in oral cultures, they had all kinds of pneumatic devices for memorizing long periods of history, and they would have these memory sticks or something of the sort that would go back 25 generations. But once they got beyond that, they created mythology to tell their story. And so in the mythology of the Aboriginal Australians, there is a figure called Wangina, who is said to have created the earth and Homo sapiens and everything having to do with it. And the world came to know Wangina with the Olympics in Sydney in the year 2000, when at one of the opening ceremonies, there was a humongous replica of the head of a Wangina. Now, this is my own personal symbol for universal creative energy. I have given mine a Buddhist halo, earth and sun eyes, and a necklace of fish. Most Aboriginal Australians would paint Wangina with black eyes, or because she was said to come from the Milky Way, they might surround her with stars. And they have all kinds of ways of doing her halo, but this is my own personal symbol. If you look at the migration map here on the bottom piece, you will discover that an interesting thing happened in South China, and that is descendants of the first water migration were met with inland descendants from the land migration, and they formed some kind of a bond and became the Austronesian culture. And from South China, so this new body called the Austronesians had the navigational skills from the water migration, and they had the cultivation skills from the inland migration. And with those two things in their possession, they went first to Taiwan, and then they went to the Philippines, then they went to central and southern Indonesia, and then they went to New Guinea. And it was from New Guinea that they kind of pulled it all together and had the knowledge to then go forth and find and populate the Polynesian islands. Now, as I said, they had incredible navigation skills. And the Polynesians have a very complex navigation system. I have made a kind of a replica of one tiny piece. My friend Lee here helped me understand that this stick chart, which shows major wave currents and the islands in relationship to those, is but one tiny piece of the system. If you were in a canoe and you had a stick chart, you could not make it to any place else because it's not a map. You would have had to memorize a series of chants which would rehearse things about the bird life and the sea life that would help you know how far you were from shore. You would have had to memorize all of the sun, moon, and moon positions and the star configurations. You would have had to know what the social customs were on each of the individual islands. That's just the tip of the iceberg. If you really want to understand it, read the memory code. But what I've been telling now so far has been our communal history, our communal story. Doesn't each one of us also want to know our individual story? Where did we come from? How did we get to be who we are? Well, as I mentioned, in 2010, I did my first DNA test. And I did the maternal side. One of my brothers did the paternal side. And I discovered my own ancestry. And I recorded it on these blocks that include how many 100,000 years ago it was and what was going on. So 150,000 years ago, we had discovered fire. By 80,000 years ago, we were migrating nomads. By 45,000 years ago, we were in the Near East developing art. By 30,000 years ago, we were organizing and innovating. By 10,000 years ago, my paternal ancestors were in Tuscany and developing and growing grain. Now, I was so fascinated by all of this, and the Genographic Project kept kept expanding their database from which they were making these interpretations. So in 2012, I did another DNA test. And this time, they told me that 41% of my DNA matched that of people in Denmark. And 40%, and I consider that to be my maternal heritage, 40% matched that of people in Tuscany, which my maternal path went from Ethiopia straight north along the Nile River and into the Near East, where they spent quite a lot of time, and then straight north through the Caucasus. And I figure they must have made it by 10,000 years ago. They must have made it up to Denmark. And the Vikings are a part of my heritage. Sorry about that. But the paternal route started from closer to Tanzania and went up and crossed again at the southern tip of the Red Sea and spent a lot of time in the Arabian Peninsula before then going west, north and west, and following the northern coast of the Mediterranean Sea to the Iberian Peninsula, where they hung around during various ice ages, before then going into Northern Europe. So this is an ancient Etruscan symbol, and it represents for me the 40% of my DNA that matches that of people in Tuscany. And these goddess figurines are here to represent the 17% of my DNA that matches that of people in Southwest Asia, the place of where our first water migration went. Now you may wonder, why this figure? Well, that's me, the very first and probably one of the few selfies I've ever done. And when I walked into a bookstore and saw this map, an old map, they used to make those, of the world, I said, well, that's my glasses. I see everything through a blown lens. But then, of course, if I'm going to use maps here, I have to use maps throughout. So this is a map of the oceans. The black areas, my fanny pack and the shoes and my hair, are the continents. And this is a map of Northern Europe, more recently where my ancestors came from. There's also some here. And this is strips from a Doctors Without Borders map. So that's how I represented myself. Later on, in 2017, I had the opportunity to travel to Spain, researching my paternal heritage, and to visit the caves at Altamira and actually see the bison painted on the ceilings. And the ceilings was so low that obviously people would have had to lie on the ground in order to view what was above. And the other intriguing thing for me is that the time at which those were painted is actually the time when the bison were leaving. It was becoming warmer, and the bison were leaving to go north where it was colder. So I speculate maybe the artists, the shamans, the leaders, whatever, were trying to communicate to their people that something was happening to the earth and that they needed to adjust. I don't know. Anyway, I also had the opportunity to go to the Human Evolution Museum in Burgos, not too far from Altamira. and learn a lot about how we got to be human.